Welcome to the Room of Lives. I'm your host, Neil. In this part of my conversation with Khristián, who is a director and PhD student of theater, he describes his undergrad in Human Ecology and why he gave up studying and performing stand-up comedy in favor of directing. He then describes how his work challenges the autocratic culture of theater directors by tracing it back to its white European historical origins. We then explore his work on the intersection between theater and scientific narrative, and how they are subconsciously shaped by our culture and power structure. We discuss why our world, which is increasingly dominated by science and technology and under the threat of climate change, needs better public scientific literacy and communication. Then we talk about science versus culture when it comes to food, medicine, and psychedelics. Okay, so now you're back. So yeah, not back. Well, you didn't actually stay in the US before you went to India, but you went to Maine for undergrad, and that was for visual arts.
No, that was for this major called Human Ecology, where I basically studied whatever I wanted, and so for 4 years, and then I did a project at the end. But that, I mean, it's more complicated than that. But what you do is that you choose your courses, and the idea is that they expect you to like integrate the knowledge from those courses, instead of just like being broad. I think of it more as like a weave or like a braid, as opposed to like something that's really spread out. And so I studied a bunch of things: environmental policy, graphic design, sustainability, food systems, anthropology, printmaking, documentary. That's why I know about sound documentaries, filmmaking, a bunch of stuff. Acting. I took one acting class, and then playwriting, etc. While I was there, I still wanted to do graphic design. I wanted to do graphic design in education. Then I decided to focus on graphic design and politics, and I wanted to do like infographics about like political structures. So it actually, I don't know if I told you this, but I got an internship and then a job at the UN.
Oh wow!
Doing that work, which I almost finished my degree early to go like focus on that. But a lot of stuff happened, and I decided I didn't want to do that in my life, and so I went back to school to finish my degree. And I for my internship, I kept working for them a little bit, doing design stuff, but I went back, and yeah, I did my internship. That was the craziest 3 months of my life. Those 3 months that I did I was interning in Italy at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and like I was a kid. That was crazy. I turned 21 when I was there. And I went back, and then it was after I finished my degree that I decided I wanted to focus on theater. But it just took me a long time to be like, okay, I want to, or not focus, but I wanted to study theater. And then that's why I came here. There's a lot of stuff that happened in those 5 years that I was in Maine. Like, I lived in Portugal, and I made all these friends, and I directed my first show, and I went to the UN summits, and I learned a lot of stuff about gender. I learned a lot of stuff about sexual assault, about sustainability, the role of education and the arts. Like, I learned a lot. Those 5, probably, yeah. I think the time between like when I first left home up until like the second year of my master's have been like super formative. And I think like now I'm finally looking at like, okay, I learned all of that, and now like I can like make sense of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the end of that, my time there, I went to study theater, and then I knew about the program here at UT, and so I applied both to NYU and here, because my faculty told me to apply to 2 places. So if I got into both, I could pit them against each other, which is really good advice. And then I came here, and I came here wanting to do not directing. I wanted to do stand-up comedy.
Wait.
So when
a master's. Well,
a master's in performance studies.
In performance studies, but you wanted to study.
The project was I wanted to make stand-up comedy and like write about it. Yeah. Okay. But then I started directing and I haven't looked back since.
Oh, have you ever done stand-up comedy?
I did 3 sets when I first moved to Austin, and it was so hard. One was I didn't really have the appropriate support to do it, but yeah, it was just hard. I realized that like it's rare that you hear me say, like that I like to tell my story the way I'm doing it like now.
Yeah.
And so and stand-up comedy is a lot of that. You have to take moments from your life and like really pull them out, and I don't think I'm in a place to do that safely yet. It's not for like a comedy performance. It's also just that like when I have exchanges with people and I'm not thinking about it as a performance, like I'm actually really funny, or I can be really funny, but I just haven't really put them, and not just for me, but like for the people around me. They're like,
yeah, I find that there's a lot of things that you do without consciously thinking, which are pretty funny.
Like what?
Like I found a couple of things that you do to be like really funny.
But what?
Okay, so the other day we were in the kitchen, and someone that you do not like so much liked one of your comments on Facebook.
Oh!
And the way that you reacted when you looked at the phone, you were like, look!
Yeah.
That was just really funny.
It's just like, and I think part of that's funny, I mean, I took a class I was TA for a class in undergrad called The Science of Comedy, is that like, I feel like that like feeling is relatable to you, or like it speaks to something in you. Yeah. And like once you name it, it becomes less funny, because it's like when you just explain the joke ceases to be funny. Yeah. But absolutely. Yeah, like
you took a class called The Science of Comedy.
I was a TA. There was a course and then my advisor taught called The Science of Comedy.
Oh shit. Wow.
Yeah, it's a cool class. Wow. But it's an amazing institution. I hope it survives the pandemic. But there's some good stuff there. So anyway, yeah, I forgot what I was saying. Oh yeah, anyway, I decided not to do stand-up maybe one day. But until then I direct, and I love directing, and I'm good at it. And what I like about it is that I can make space for other people to do their job well, and to do, and not just that, but like to approach their practice and what they do in ways that have been for some people pretty transformative. And so yeah. Okay,
so now I want to kind of transition to the topic of what you have been doing mostly so you've been doing your master's here, right? Since you moved. And are you in a PhD program now?
Yes.
Or okay.
I'm about to start. Unless I get kicked out because I gotta be in one of my classes, I'm gonna start the second year of my PhD.
Yeah. So what is it that you have been working on in grad school?
A lot of things, but my primary research project in my master's had to do with the Me Too movement, and trying to understand, or it was inspired by the Me Too movement, but trying to look at what are the mechanisms that allow theater directors in particular to abuse their power with their actors so much. And so it was a really very hard project, because one, there's not a lot written about directors, but two, the nature of the problem itself is that the power that directors and producers like Harvey Weinstein is unquestionable. And what I was doing is that I was questioning it and saying that's not natural, or it doesn't have to be a given. And so I did some like reflective journaling, and I produced a bunch of plays. I produced 4 plays. But really what the crux of my research ended up being looking at, I theorized a little bit, but like the most solid aspect of it was doing historical research that needs more fleshing out, but of why is the reason that these directors become so abusive or so autocratic, not abusive, is that they, from the beginning, when the field was invented and created by these 2 European white guys, one Russian and one German, and then the Russian and French people that followed them, directors were able to just define their roles by themselves and like anoint themselves as directors, and create the system by which they work with the actors, like the rules. And because it involves working with the actors' bodies, you cross the line between like an exercise and like a transgression.
Oh yeah.
A lot more easily. But because with every new iteration, each director that saw what someone else did and worked, then created their own system, and then they rarely credited the people that they took inspiration from. So because they were the ones who invented it, they became like geniuses, and nobody could question them. A little bit how like the myth of the scientific genius in science, you know, that like Darwin or Einstein, like they're seen as these geniuses, but they also picked up on a lot of work that came before them.
Yeah.
They just did it in a way that was a lot more visible, and it was really significant. But those men, and I don't know enough about Einstein's work, but I'm very sure this is the case. Did not invent
they definitely, at least not just in the popular imagination, but even among the scientific community, the way that Einstein is perceived as having come up. I mean, of course, that guy was kind of a genius.
Right.
But a lot of the things that he used had actually been derived by mathematicians that came before him.
Exactly.
And he like took some of that. He had friends explain those things to him, and it was like, oh, I guess I could use this and this, and blah, blah, blah. But the view that we have is a much more simplified view.
Absolutely.
All of it came from his brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same, like, I mean, when I learned that Isaac Newton studied alchemy and like dark magics, I'm like, we remember him as the man who discovered gravity. But the truth is that he was doing a lot of other things that we also don't remember. And so that image of like and it's funny because the directors came around the time that this idea of like the inventor came around, like these men that stood alone as like the sole creators of knowledge. I kind of became interested in that, and so what I'm doing right now is I'm translating that chapter of my thesis into a publication, hopefully. Nice. Basically inviting that when we teach acting and especially directing, we teach that these skills come from a particular place and a particular time, so that directors know that they're not, if they don't work for them, then they can always change them. So building a little bit more awareness, and then just outlining that like the reason that the profession is so prone to abuse is because one, it was started by a guy who was royalty, and he set the example for doing it in a particularly abusive way. But two, that if you don't tell people what your methods are, then they can adopt them, but they can't question them, and that's not good for the practice or for the people that they're working with. If that makes sense. And so that's essentially my little bit my argument. But that was my master's research, and at that time, but because of all the other stuff I'd done and even my background in Guatemala, I've just always been interested in the intersection between theater became interested in the intersection between theater and science, and that's my PhD research. Looking at theatrical naturalism and how scientific knowledge, I think like the entanglement between scientific knowledge and artistic practice, because I firmly believe we're about to go into a phase, and we are already in a phase where theater is trying to incorporate scientific principles about the environment. And I think it's useful to look back at like what the implications were the last time that we did it, so that we can do it more consciously. Not better or worse, but just more consciously.
What do you mean the last time?
Theatrical naturalism. So the last time that theater intersected with science meaningfully, or not the last major... A time when theater intermingled with science in a way that fundamentally changed theater was the time that we began to adapt Darwinism and other principles around evolution as a way to prescribe theater as a universal truth. But it was proclaimed to be universal, but because it generated in Europe, it created this version of reality and of naturalism that was rooted in the concepts of that time. And it's the same with like the ideas behind psychology, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot of scholarship now that like, you know, hysteria was a disease that was invented or created to like essentially like tame like unruly women. And so the history of scientific knowledge in psychology in particular has been done with like a normal mind, which is like, you know, because of the subjects, like white European, mostly men, who were also like followed really Christian values, and those were some of the ideals about like what the mind is in psychology that then were projected onto what realism is on stage and psychological realism. So I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying like that's what happened. That there's like a lot of like cultural conceptions about who is like the universal human subject that then were put on stage, and it was like, this is realism, this is naturalism, this is the universal truth. I don't think the playwrights intended it to be as colonial as it was, but because they weren't aware of it, they were like circulating it. And now, today, when I make a place and I cast, people like who look like you or who speak like me, or who look like me if I don't look very white, then like that person's like not just cultural, but like I think epistemological questions about like, what does it mean to know? What does it mean to be normal? What does it mean to be what does it mean to do a play that's real? I think the pandemic also has put into question a lot of like what it means for something to be feasible or real. I mean, it's a giant like black swan, right, in terms of complexity theory. But there's this Indian author, Amitabh Ghosh, who he's Bengali, and he wrote this book called Climate Change and the Unthinkable, mostly chastising the modern novel, and sort of saying how like when the modern novel tried to capture what was feasible, it also captured like a form of like plausible things that could happen that were in line with like bourgeois European values in the late 1800s. And so like he writes that even though like he was in Delhi once when there was an actual tornado in Delhi, and he's never been able to use that in his writing because it reads like science fiction, or because people say like, well, that wouldn't happen. And so his whole point is that because not just novels, but many narratives we've had about what could happen have been so culturally specific, but we haven't realized that they are culturally specific. We've lost the ability to think the unthinkable, like climate change, or whereas if we had centered, the people in Mauritius or island Pacific communities who don't build houses by the beach because they know that the ocean rages, and they build further in, but the white people and the colonizers and the hotels all built houses by the beach. Like if we had centered like those people's notions of plausibility, the narrative around like where do we build houses would be really different. And so the centering of the cultural knowledge shapes our assumptions about what's possible.
Yeah.
And that was a huge impact that I argue naturalism had in theater. We're just coming to terms with it now because now we're like, well, the climate is changing, animals are dying. It's not just about us, but so how do we do it well? And so and it gets stuff like science fiction theater. So.
Yeah. Something that I believe, okay, so what really interests me is that, yes, from a very young age, I've also been interested in science.
Mm-hmm.
But like you, I've also been interested in art. Mm-hmm. And I feel very interested. Okay, so when it comes to science, I feel very interested in doing science from the inside. Mm-hmm. But I'm also very interested in looking at science from the perspective of a not scientist. Mm-hmm. From the perspective of someone who does not identify as a scientist. Mm-hmm. So for me, for example, science communication is very important. Mm-hmm. Or the, how do I say it? There's no word for this, but how you make something into art. For me, doing that to science is very important. How do you make art out of science? And I think that as a society, we are accelerating into a future, even our present, which is increasingly science and technology dominated. Mm-hmm. Like, even for someone whose immediate reality doesn't have to do with working in science or whatever, compared to 20 years ago, we are surrounded by technology and science. So for the vast majority of people to be living in such a society, I feel like it is really, really crucial for them to know more science. in order to have a more informed voice when it comes to like political decisions and things like that. If you're living in a world that is facing climate change, then I feel like a lot more people need to know the science behind it. But you cannot expect everyone to be talked to using a technical scientific language. So I feel like there exists this big discrepancy between the world that we live in and the perception of it by the majority. And I've seen this kind of thing from the inside of the scientific community, where oftentimes there's this dismissive, it's like, oh, this is not for the layperson or whatever. We're just going to keep on doing the science and here's what it says. And we don't really care about what other people think. There are some scientists who are working in, for example, the climate thing, and they're like working towards promoting awareness of the general public. But a lot of scientists are content to just do the science and like, okay, I don't care about the rest.
Right.
Yeah. But I feel like that is very important too. I don't know where I'm getting at, but I'm just saying that it feels very important to be bridging the world of the scientist and the non-scientist, because we're all kind of in this together. So that's something, that's a world that you've kind of been living in. From what I understand, like you've been working with theater as a means of communication of stories of the world or about science. So I would like to know what your thoughts are of what science looks like from the outside. And yeah.
I mean, I just had this conversation, and this whole year I've been involved in a project called Planet Texas 2015. I think more and more the problem is that I think there's a couple of layers to it, but the very first one is that, or no, the first thing that comes to mind is that I don't think enough scientists understand that their concepts, although they are describing physical, environmental, in that sense, natural phenomena, the concept or the language that are used to describe that is not universal. Like the knowledge of the word. For example, there's this guy in Planet Texas that works with ranchers, and they refuse to use the word climate change in Texas because it's politicized and stuff like that. But they know the weather's changing. And the difference here is that like ranchers, and I would argue to your point that like people need to know the climate is changing. I think people know the climate is changing. Like people who work the land, people who fish the seas, people who work in mountains, forests, deserts, like, and even people who go to work every day who expect the climate to be a certain way, like my aunts, and it just isn't. So I think people know the weather is changing. It's just that the concept of the word climate comes from scientific, to go back to the cultural and like social and like historical factors that influence what a concept is. Like the word climate and that concept, because you can only perceive it over super long periods of time, unless that's passed down through stories like it is in indigenous communities. The only way to access that knowledge is through science. And so just you're using a scientific concept, and centering the scientific concept becomes more important than it becomes more important that the scientists are right than that people get it, if that makes sense. So it's like we want people to call it climate. And it's been politicized. It's been because of people like Donald Trump. We want people to call it climate change. But we get so lost in the name climate that like if they have another way they want to describe it for themselves. And that's just as valid if that's going to let them respond to it. And so I think not enough scientists understand that their work is embedded in politics. Whether they like it or not, it is embedded in politics. Because like, and it's not, doesn't mean that it's always bad. I used to be really against data. And I have come around with that because I realized that like, if the communities that are impacted by the technology have a means to use it, then I think technology in itself is not inherently bad. Because back to your point, like I think even before the last 10 years, we already lived in a super, like since we discovered fire, we've lived in technology-driven worlds. It's just that now it's a much faster form of technology, right? Like Google just announced quantum computing, right? Who knows what that's going to do. So, and there's all this talk of 5G towers and stuff like that. But before that, we had microwaves, and we had cars without seatbelts, and we had people who smoked inside. And so, like, to me, it's less about being able to communicate the science now, and more about understanding that, like, all of those concepts come from a specific place, and, like, as long as people get what it is, to me, the name doesn't matter that much. And so if we can all get into the general agreement that, like, we are fucking up the planet, whether you want to call it the atmosphere or the stratosphere or the ozone layer or whatever, but, like, that there is something that we need to change so that the planet can exist longer. I don't care what we call it. You know what I mean? I'm less invested in it. When I studied environmental politics, one of the things that we talked about so much is that most international environmental treaties fail because they either fail in the negotiation phase or they get negotiated. Their implementation just never happens. That's what happened with the Kyoto Protocol. That's what happened with the Minamata Convention on Mercury. This is all the stuff I studied for my undergrad thesis. There's the one shining example was the Montreal Protocol on carbon depletion, ozone depletion substances, because there was, first of all, an agreement that there was a problem. There was an agreement on what the problem was, and there's an agreement on what the solution should be for that problem. With climate change, we can't even agree that there's a problem. And so there's value in having shared language, and in that case, it was the industrialized societies that were most at risk, because it was like Australia and in Europe that were going to be most damaged by the skin cancer coming from that. There were also some of the most producing and consuming of the substances, and the ones that could change that. So because the problem geographically and culturally was more shared, and because it wasn't as tied to, like, I mean, there was the industry behind HFCs, but, like, it's mostly like refrigerants. Like, it's not nearly as lucrative as, like, carbon and oil. So I think that's where language has become politicized. And so to me, I originally became interested in science communication, but more and more I'm realizing that I'm more interested in how do we highlight the ways that people already make sense of their environments in ways that are empirical, that are observational, that are methodical. It's just not published and it's not peer reviewed, but it doesn't mean it's any less valid because that's how they live their lives. It's limited, but it's not any less valid. And so I'm more interested in scientists learning to listen, in that sense, and knowing that, like, the things that people discover, like the drugs that get synthesized in pharmaceutical companies, for example, this is probably a little different in physics than it is in life sciences. But, like, the drugs that get patented by, like, pharmaceutical companies, they rely on the observational knowledge of indigenous communities to know which plants to know which compounds even to begin looking for. And so, or if they arrive at it separately, it's the same kind of solution that another group already thought about, because their science just has happened over, like, generations.
Totally.
If that makes sense. I mean, a lot of those knowledge traditions exist in India as well, in terms of, like, you know, knowing that cumin is a natural digestive.
Like Ayurveda or...
Exactly. And so it isn't to say that, like, one should take precedence over the other. It's just that, like, to me, all knowledge just has, because it comes from specific, not all, but, like, many forms of knowledge come from a specific time and place. They also have specific uses and scopes where they're valid, and many where they're not. Especially when you think of something like climate, or being associated with a PhD or a research university, that already, because of the history of universities, that already puts barriers between you and the people you want to communicate with. My family always, I mean, I'm the first person to even attempt a PhD, and I feel like there's a lot of barriers between what they feel they can talk to me about, because I don't know if you experience any of that.
No, not really. I mean, I feel like sometimes I feel like, a lot of the times I feel like I just won't be able to talk about my work in a way that is comprehensible to them. But other than that, I don't really feel much of a... Okay, so I should explain a little bit that from a very young age, my dad was a geologist, and from a very young age, he really encouraged me to pursue science. So with my dad, I haven't had so much trouble, like, telling him. He's always very curious, and I, like, try to tell him, and maybe he doesn't even understand, but he's curious about it. So Yeah, so I haven't had as much trouble there. But in general, I don't have a lot of conversations other than that about what I'm doing. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. What was it that I was just about to say? Oh, yeah. So, you know what this brings to my mind is, so I read this book called In Defense of Food.
Michael Pollan?
By Michael Pollan. And it was basically about two things. One was about what is good to eat.
Eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
Yes. And the other was his kind of exposition of the history of how the US food industry and culture became as confusing and, you know, just mind-numbingly confusing as it has today, that everyone is relying on some kind of external experts. New diets keep coming up. He said this is a uniquely Western, maybe specifically American phenomenon. There are so many cultures around the world where they all eat different things. Like the Mediterranean diet is not the same as the Indian diet. So they eat all different things, but they're in general, in many dimensions, they're way healthier. Much less at risk of heart disease and cancer and things like that. And it seems less because of, like, it's not like a specific thing that they're all eating. They're all eating different things. But also, food science is not at all that prevalent in those countries. Like in India, food science is not even a thing.
Guatemala as well.
Yeah.
If it is, it's just in the industrial context.
Yeah. So he was saying, what the hell is going on? The US is this country where so much food science and technology happens, but perhaps coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally at all, health, like, you know, food health is not all that great. So he was saying, you know, there are a lot of perverted motivations that are going into the research that's happening. The food science is not really, number one, it's not neutral. A lot of it is contaminated with like motivations for, like, okay, we are manufacturing this thing, and
or just not transparent. Like,
but
not transparent.
So he was saying, so what he was advocating for is that if you look at different cultures around the world, these cultures have filtered across so many generations. They have filtered what is good to eat and what is not good to eat from experience and handed down that experience. So he was advocating for more food culture and less food science. And I feel like the same thing could apply to medicine as well. Like you're talking about medicine. And I read that book and it made a lot of sense to me. I was like, okay, we are talking about things like food and medicine, which are things that we put in our body, and our bodies are very complicated natural
we don't fully
things.
Understand them,
It's so complicated inside once you read some biology that we are deluding ourselves if, no matter how smart we are and how sophisticated our labs and our research techniques, that we know that because of a couple of years of research, we know exactly what this product is going to do to our body.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah. So the only way, or at least a much more reliable way, is to go and ask a culture that have been dealing with this food or this medicine for so many thousands of generations. And that's also where the concern of genetically modified food comes. Like, okay, you figured something out. How long have you been eating this?
Right.
Do you know what this does?
Yeah.
And personally, I want to research psychedelics. And psychedelics is something that science is really getting into and has gotten into in the past, manufacturing psychedelics, etc. But a lot of these psychedelics, or the knowledge of psychedelics, comes from indigenous cultures, like a lot of Latin American cultures, like in Brazil and stuff like that.
Interesting, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I feel like it's very important to be learning from them, and you can't always...
Or with them.
Yeah, learning with them. I went to a psychedelics conference in New York last October, and it was this Native American person who kind of came and gave a talk about his perspective on this new resurgence in research in peyote and all of these kinds of things. And he was saying, for us, it's not just little medicine. It's part of our culture, and it's not just the medicine, it's all of the real human elements that surround it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the chemical.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying if you take it out of that culture and remove it from all of that context and put it in a pill, I cannot promise you that it will help you anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that is something that science and technology tries to do. Is like, we'll go to the essence and we'll put it in a bottle and we'll give it to you. And I don't think it's...
No, because it's not about that. And that's another thing too, that like a lot of these more complex ways of being both indigenous but also artistic challenge the notion of a unit.
Yeah.
What it means to be more than a unit, or what does it mean to have like, in complexity theory is like a system is not just the sum of its parts, right?
Yeah.
But I think more in the critical theory sense and indigenous studies is that like it's not just like the object, it's the entirety of the context around it.
Yeah.
Both in terms of like the other people, but also like the time of the day, how long it happens, like, and that's where like, to me, performance is really interesting, like being in a room with people, because it is that complexity, that it isn't about like the same, it isn't about, I mean, we used my the first play that I directed at UT, we did I think with telephones, and it was just really awesome thing that I'm really proud of. But it wasn't about the individual cell phones. We had 50 iPhones, but like we could have had 50 iPhones, but it was those 50 iPhones within that space at that time with those people that you could have taken one out and it would have completely lost the meaning that it had on it. And I think to me it's not just about the meaning but about the function of like what that meant. And that's where like I really do see a convergence between like being in the world as like a performance maker, because it makes you pay attention to all of these factors that, as you say, scientists tend to be hyper focused because of the way the knowledge is built and the discipline exists.
Just isolate factor X.
Exactly. It's like isolate, which is why I wouldn't have, I didn't become, I think I would have been a really good doctor, would have been an awful scientist otherwise. That I cannot isolate, I think, from its context. Yeah. It makes it really, it's really, really, and I'm sure other people struggle with that too. Yeah. But I see more relationships between things. Yeah.
I think it's within the community of science, there are different cultures. So one of the real cool things that happened during my time in my current research group is that one time I heard my advisor talk about the different kinds of scientists. And it was kind of a joke, but he said, I feel like, science can be done in like and so he had this dichotomous ways of dividing scientists into like groups. And he said, okay, so there's one dimension, lumper versus splitter. Like, are you a scientist that is looking for holistic theories that integrate things? Or are you a scientist that are splitting? So there's lumper versus splitter.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Then there's like the driller versus the scratcher. He was like, there are people that go really deep into one theory, and there are people who scratch like multiple different things. It was really interesting for me to hear his whole classification. Yeah. And as he was talking about this, he would say, I think I'm this kind of scientist. And I was mentally checking. Yeah. And like pretty much along all of those dimensions, I lined up with him. I was like, yes, I'm in the right research group.
Yeah, that's good.
So he sees our work as being more like a lumper versus splitter. So we try to connect different things together. So I feel like that's a very important pillar of science, not just isolate, but also connect things together. Because it's not just about science, like that's how the world is. Yeah. And if you have to have a faithful account of the world, you have to acknowledge that things don't work in isolation. They're a very complex, interconnected web.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today in the Room of Lives. In the next and final part of my conversation with Khristián, he shares his thoughts on whether he feels at home in Guatemala and the US, and we conclude with his observations on awareness as an artistic process.